"If Emily Carter goes back up that ridge, she's not coming back down," someone said over the radio. And for a moment, nobody in the command tent had an answer. The helicopter sat stranded on a remote mountainside nearly 2 miles from the nearest safe landing zone. Surrounded by fog, rough terrain, and fading daylight, a handful of soldiers waited beside it, cut off from the rest of their unit after a mission that had gone badly wrong. Back at Fort Raven, officers stared at maps. Radio operators listened for updates, and tension spread across the base like a storm cloud. Then a voice came through the headset. Calm, steady, unshaken. "I'm going." That voice belonged to Specialist Emily Carter. 3 hours earlier, most people on that military base had been laughing at her. They called her too small, too quiet, too weak for combat. Some said she never should have been assigned to operational missions in the first place. Others claimed she was only there because someone higher up wanted to make a point. Emily had heard it all before. She never argued. She never defended herself. She simply did her job and kept moving forward. But now, as experienced soldiers hesitated and commanders weighed impossible choices, the person volunteering to climb back into the mountains was the same woman many had dismissed that very morning. The radio crackled again. Wind swept across the ridgeline, carrying temperatures down into the low 40s. Visibility continued to drop. Every minute mattered. Emily adjusted the straps on her pack and checked her equipment one final time. The pilot who had spoken earlier shook his head. "You know how risky this is." Emily nodded once. "I do." There was no dramatic speech, no attempt to inspire anyone. She simply turned toward the trail and started walking. Inside the command tent, conversations stopped. Several soldiers exchanged uncertain looks. One of them was Sergeant Logan Brooks. Just hours earlier, Logan had stood in front of half the unit during a mission briefing and questioned whether Emily belonged on the team. He remembered the laughter that followed. He remembered the comments. He remembered seeing Emily sitting quietly at the end of the table, showing no reaction at all. Now he watched her location marker move across the digital map while everyone else remained still. The irony was impossible to ignore. Outside, the evening sky darkened over Fort Raven. Mechanics paused their work near the motor pool. Soldiers gathered around monitors showing live mission updates. Word spread quickly across the installation. Emily Carter was heading back into the mountains alone to reach stranded personnel before conditions became impossible. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next. Nobody knew whether she would succeed. But for the first time, the whispers about her disappeared. The jokes stopped. The assumptions faded. And as her signal moved farther into the wilderness, an entire military base found itself watching the one soldier they had underestimated the most. 3 hours before anyone was watching her progress across a mountain ridge, Specialist Emily Carter had been sitting quietly in a crowded briefing room at Fort Raven. The room smelled faintly of coffee, dust, and equipment that had seen too many training exercises. Maps covered the walls, mission schedules filled digital screens, and more than 24 soldiers waited for the morning briefing to begin. Emily sat near the back with a notebook resting on her knee. She listened carefully, occasionally writing a note, but otherwise drew little attention to herself. That was normal. Most people barely noticed her unless they were making assumptions about her. At 29 years old, Emily looked younger than many of the soldiers around her. She stood just over 5 feet 4 inches tall, carried herself quietly, and rarely joined the loud conversations that echoed through the barracks and training grounds. To some people, that meant she lacked confidence. To others, it meant she lacked experience. Neither assumption was true. Captain Daniel Mercer entered the room and began reviewing the details of a reconnaissance mission scheduled for later that day. The assignment involved traveling through a rugged mountain sector nearly 40 miles from the base. Weather reports predicted increasing cloud cover, but conditions remained acceptable for deployment. As Mercer reviewed team assignments, several soldiers exchanged glances when Emily's name appeared on the roster. The reactions were subtle at first. A raised eyebrow, a smirk, a quiet laugh. Then Sergeant Logan Brooks leaned back in his chair and spoke loudly enough for half the room to hear. "That terrain is going to be rough. Are we sure Carter should be going?" A few soldiers chuckled. Logan shrugged as though he were asking a reasonable question. I am just saying somebody has to carry equipment up those slopes. More laughter followed. Emily kept her eyes on her notebook. Captain Mercer continued the briefing without comment, but the atmosphere had already changed. One soldier whispered that Emily would probably slow the team down. Another suggested she would be better suited to administrative work. None of them knew much about her. Most had never even trained alongside her for more than a few hours. Yet opinions formed quickly inside military communities, and once a reputation started, it often spread faster than facts. Emily remained silent, not because the comments did not bother her. They did. She was human. She heard every word. But she had learned years earlier that arguing rarely changed minds. Performance did. When the briefing ended, soldiers stood and gathered their gear. Logan passed by Emily's chair and paused. Nothing personal, he said. I just think some missions require a different kind of soldier. Emily looked up calmly. Maybe. That single word caught him off guard. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just quiet certainty. Logan frowned slightly before walking away. He thought the conversation was over. What he did not realize was that before the day ended, circumstances would place his future in the hands of the very soldier he doubted most. The convoy departed Fort Raven just after noon. A line of military vehicles wound through narrow mountain roads that cut across miles of rugged terrain. Gray clouds drifted overhead, casting long shadows across the hillsides. Emily sat near the rear of the formation reviewing navigation data and weather reports. Around her, conversations came and went. Most soldiers talked about weekend plans, training schedules, or how quickly the mission would be completed. Logan Brooks sat several seats away, joking with another sergeant about the briefing from earlier that morning. Every now and then, his eyes drifted toward Emily. She could feel it, but she ignored it. The mission itself seemed straightforward. Travel to an observation site, verify several reconnaissance points, and return before sunset. Nothing about the assignment suggested it would become the most important day of anyone's career. After nearly 2 hours on the road, the convoy reached a staging area near the base of the mountains. Soldiers unloaded equipment and prepared for the next phase of the operation. The climb ahead covered several steep ridges and narrow trails. Captain Daniel Mercer gathered the team and reviewed the route one final time. As the briefing concluded, one of the younger soldiers struggled to secure a communications pack. The equipment kept slipping from its mounting straps. Before anyone else noticed, Emily stepped over and adjusted the connections. Her movements were quick and efficient. Within seconds, the pack was secure. The young soldier thanked her. Emily nodded and moved on. She did not know that Captain Mercer had been watching the entire exchange. He had seen similar moments for months. Small problems appeared. Emily solved them. Equipment failed. Emily fixed it. Plans changed. Emily adapted. Most people overlooked those details because they were focused on louder personalities. Mercer was not. The climb began shortly afterward. The terrain grew steeper with every mile. Loose rock covered sections of the trail, and visibility slowly decreased as low clouds rolled through the mountains. Several soldiers began breathing harder under the weight of their gear. Despite carrying the same load as everyone else, Emily maintained a steady pace. She neither rushed nor fell behind. She simply moved forward. During a short break, Logan noticed something he had not expected. A few members of the team quietly approached Emily with questions about navigation and terrain conditions. She answered each one calmly. There was no boasting, no attempt to impress anyone. Yet the confidence in her voice suggested familiarity with the environment. Logan found himself wondering how someone he considered inexperienced seemed so comfortable in conditions that challenged others. The answer remained hidden. As afternoon turned toward evening, the weather worsened. Wind speeds increased. Clouds thickened. Radio reception became inconsistent. Captain Mercer ordered the team to accelerate their timeline and begin moving toward the extraction point. What nobody knew was that several miles ahead, circumstances were already changing. A series of unexpected developments would soon force the mission far beyond its original objectives. And when that moment arrived, the quiet specialist many had underestimated would be the one person prepared for what came next. By late afternoon, the mountains looked completely different from when the team had started its climb. Thick clouds rolled through the valleys, swallowing distant ridgelines and turning familiar landmarks into vague shadows. Captain Daniel Mercer checked his map against the latest coordinates and frowned. Several planned observation points had become inaccessible due to the changing conditions. What should have been a routine operation was becoming increasingly complicated. The team adjusted its route and continued forward. Radio traffic came and went in fragments as weather interference grew stronger. Conversations became shorter. Everyone sensed that conditions were shifting faster than expected. During one of the communication checks, a transmission arrived from another unit operating several miles away. The signal was weak and broken, but one detail immediately caught Mercer's attention. A support helicopter assigned to assist regional operations had reported mechanical issues and was attempting to reach a safe landing area before conditions deteriorated further. The message ended abruptly before additional information could be transmitted. Nobody knew exactly where the aircraft was or whether it had reached safety. The uncertainty settled over the team like a weight. Mercer ordered his soldiers to maintain awareness and continue toward the extraction route. As they moved through a narrow section of trail, Emily studied the terrain around them. Her eyes tracked the cloud movement, the direction of the wind, and the changing visibility. She quietly approached Mercer. "Sir, the weather is moving faster through the western ridge than predicted." Mercer looked at the horizon. "You think we should alter the route?" Emily nodded. "If we stay on the current path much longer, we may lose visibility completely." Mercer considered her assessment. Before he could answer, Logan Brooks stepped closer. "We have a plan already. We should stick to it." Emily did not argue. She simply stepped back. Mercer looked from Logan to Emily and then back toward the approaching clouds. Something about Emily's observation stayed with him. Over the past several months, he had learned that she rarely spoke unless she had a reason. 10 minutes later, the answer arrived. Visibility dropped dramatically. Trails that had been clear moments earlier became difficult to follow. The team slowed its pace and regrouped. Mercer immediately ordered a route adjustment that closely matched the recommendation Emily had made earlier. Nobody commented on it, but several soldiers noticed. As evening approached, another transmission finally broke through the static. This one was stronger. A support helicopter had made an emergency landing high in the mountains. Several personnel remained stranded near the aircraft. Weather conditions were preventing immediate recovery efforts. Additional assistance would be required before nightfall. The message changed everything. The original mission no longer mattered. The focus shifted to locating and supporting the stranded personnel. Mercer gathered the team and reviewed the limited information available. Distances were estimated. Conditions remained uncertain. Every option carried risk. While soldiers discussed possible approaches, Emily quietly examined the terrain map. She recognized something others had missed. A narrow route connected their current position to the reported location of the stranded crew. It was difficult but passable. Mercer noticed her studying the map and walked over. "You see something?" Emily pointed to the route. For a moment Mercer said nothing. Then he slowly nodded. Far away, hidden beyond the fog and ridges, a group of stranded service members waited for help. And without realizing it, the team had just taken the first step toward the moment that would change how an entire military base viewed Specialist Emily Carter. Captain Daniel Mercer gathered the team beneath a rocky overhang as the weather continued to deteriorate. A cold wind swept across the mountains, carrying mist through the valleys and reducing visibility with each passing minute. The latest coordinates from command indicated that the stranded helicopter crew was still waiting near the emergency landing site, but communication remained unreliable. Every few minutes a signal appeared, only to fade again into static. Mercer studied the map illuminated by a small tactical light. The direct route was becoming increasingly dangerous because of the weather. The longer route would take several additional hours. Neither option was ideal. Around him, soldiers quietly discussed possibilities. Some believed they should hold position and wait for improved conditions. Others argued that time was working against the stranded crew. The debate continued until Emily pointed toward the narrow route she had identified earlier. "If we move now, we can reach the ridge before visibility drops further." Several soldiers looked skeptical. One of them immediately questioned whether the path was even usable. Emily calmly explained the terrain features, elevation changes, and natural landmarks that could guide movement despite the fog. Her explanation was precise. She spoke without hesitation, as though she had walked similar terrain many times before. Logan Brooks listened carefully. For the first time all day, he found himself paying attention instead of dismissing her opinion. Captain Mercer made his decision. The team would move. They packed their equipment and continued through the mountains as daylight slowly faded. The trail narrowed into a winding passage between steep rock formations. Progress became slower, forcing everyone to concentrate on each step. Several times soldiers lost sight of one another in the fog and had to regroup. During one particularly difficult section, a young specialist became disoriented and started following the wrong marker. Before anyone else noticed, Emily redirected him back onto the correct path. Minutes later, she identified another navigation error in the digital mapping system. A section of terrain had been updated after a recent landslide, making the original route inaccurate. Without the correction, the team could have lost valuable time. Small moments like these continued throughout the journey. Each one seemed minor by itself. Together, they began changing perceptions. Soldiers who had barely spoken to Emily before now found themselves relying on her observations. Even Logan started noticing how often her recommendations prevented problems before they occurred. Eventually, the team reached a high ridge overlooking a distant valley. Through breaks in the fog, they could finally see faint emergency lights far below. The stranded helicopter had been located. Relief spread through the group. The objective was no longer theoretical. Real people were waiting for assistance, and they were closer than anyone expected. Captain Mercer lowered his binoculars and looked toward Emily. "Good call on the route." She simply nodded. There was no celebration, no speech, just another quiet acknowledgement before moving forward. But as the team began their descent toward the valley, an unexpected update arrived from command. Conditions were worsening across the region. Air support would be delayed. Ground assistance would have to take over. Suddenly, the responsibility resting on their shoulders became much larger than anyone had anticipated. And among all the soldiers standing on that mountain, the person who seemed least surprised was Emily Carter. The descent into the valley proved even more difficult than the climb that had brought them there. Darkness settled across the mountains, and the last traces of daylight disappeared behind a wall of clouds. The team relied on navigation equipment, terrain markers, and disciplined movement to continue forward. Far below, the emergency lights remained visible through the fog, blinking like distant stars against the mountainside. Captain Daniel Mercer maintained communication with command whenever signals allowed, but updates were limited. Weather conditions across the region continued to deteriorate. Additional aircraft could not safely reach the area. The responsibility remained with the soldiers already on the mountain. As the team moved closer to the stranded crew, a new challenge emerged. Several routes that appeared passable on the map had become blocked by unstable terrain and recent storm damage. Progress slowed to a crawl. Soldiers gathered around digital displays, comparing possible alternatives. Every option seemed to create another delay. Time was becoming their greatest enemy. While the others debated, Emily studied the landscape around them. She walked a short distance to a rocky overlook and observed the valley through binoculars. After several minutes, she returned and pointed toward a narrow ridgeline hidden behind a series of outcroppings. "That route is still open," she said. One soldier immediately questioned whether it could support the entire team. Emily calmly explained the elevation profile, estimated travel time, and landmarks she had identified through the fog. Her confidence drew attention. This time nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed her suggestion. Captain Mercer reviewed her assessment and nodded. "We move her way." The decision saved nearly an hour. As the team advanced along the ridgeline, even the most skeptical soldiers began recognizing something unusual. Emily seemed to understand the terrain almost instinctively. She anticipated obstacles before they appeared. She identified safer paths through difficult sections. She remained calm while others grew frustrated. Logan Brooks found himself replaying every conversation he had ever had about her. The image he had built in his mind no longer matched reality. Eventually, the team reached a position overlooking the emergency landing site. The helicopter rested on a relatively flat section of ground surrounded by steep slopes. Several stranded personnel waited nearby, conserving energy and maintaining communication whenever possible. Relief spread through the group. They had found them, yet a new problem immediately became clear. The weather was now so severe that extracting everyone before sunrise would require careful planning and precise coordination. Captain Mercer began organizing the operation, but before he could finish, a communications failure disrupted contact with command. Signals vanished completely. For the first time that night, the team was truly on its own. Several soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Without outside guidance, every decision carried greater weight. Mercer looked around at his team, evaluating options. Before anyone spoke, Emily quietly stepped forward with a practical solution for maintaining communication, coordinating movement, and preparing the stranded crew for the long night ahead. The plan was simple, efficient, effective. Mercer listened carefully and then gave a single nod. Around them, soldiers immediately began following her recommendations. And as the operation entered its most critical stage, the quiet specialist who had once been the target of jokes was becoming the person everyone trusted most. The night stretched on as freezing winds swept across the mountains. Visibility remained poor, and every task required patience and coordination. Under Captain Daniel Mercer's direction, the team established a temporary support area near the stranded helicopter while preparing for a safe extraction once conditions improved. What surprised many of the soldiers was how naturally Emily had stepped into a leadership role without ever trying to claim one. She moved from group to group, checking equipment, verifying plans, and making sure every person understood their responsibilities. There was nothing dramatic about it. She simply saw problems and solved them before they grew larger. As the hours passed, confidence within the team began to return. Communication systems that had failed earlier were partially restored using the procedures Emily suggested. Navigation markers were placed along critical sections of the route. Supply inventories were reorganized. Every improvement made the situation more manageable. At one point, a sudden shift in weather forced the team to reconsider part of their extraction plan. Several soldiers gathered around a map, uncertain which route would remain usable by morning. Emily studied the terrain for a few moments before offering an alternative path that avoided the areas most affected by the storm. Her recommendation was carefully evaluated and ultimately adopted. Once again, it worked. Logan Brooks watched the entire process with growing disbelief. Earlier that same day, he had questioned whether Emily belonged on the mission at all. Now experienced soldiers were seeking her input before making important decisions. What troubled him most was realizing that she had never once reminded anyone they were wrong about her. She had never demanded respect. She had simply earned it. Near midnight, Mercer gathered key personnel for a final planning session. The latest weather reports suggested a narrow window of improved conditions shortly after sunrise. If they were prepared, the stranded crew could be safely escorted out of the valley and reunited with support units waiting farther down the mountain. The plan required precise timing and disciplined execution. As responsibilities were assigned, Mercer paused and looked toward Emily. "You take point on route coordination." Several soldiers exchanged glances. Nobody objected. In fact, most seemed relieved. The assignment reflected what everyone had already begun to understand. Emily possessed knowledge and judgment that could not be ignored. She accepted the responsibility with the same calm expression she always carried. No smile, no celebration, just a simple nod. Hours later, as the first traces of dawn appeared behind the mountains, movement finally began. Guided by careful planning and teamwork, the group started making steady progress towards safety. Conditions remained difficult, but confidence replaced uncertainty. Along the route, Logan found himself walking beside Emily. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You knew what you were doing this whole time, did you not?" Emily looked ahead at the trail. "I knew my job." Logan lowered his eyes. The answer was simple, but it carried more weight than any speech he could imagine. For the first time since meeting her, he understood exactly who Emily Carter was. And more importantly, he understood how badly he had misjudged her. When the team finally emerged from the mountains, Fort Raven was already waiting. News of the operation had spread across the installation long before the first vehicles arrived. Soldiers gathered near the operations center. Mechanics paused their work, and administrative staff stepped outside to watch the returning convoy. What had begun as a routine mission had become the most talked-about event on the base in months. Captain Daniel Mercer delivered his initial report immediately upon arrival. Senior officers listened carefully as he outlined the sequence of events: the weather challenges, the communication failures, and the successful recovery of the stranded personnel. Throughout the briefing, one name appeared again and again: Specialist Emily Carter. At first, several officers assumed Mercer was simply recognizing a soldier who had performed well. Then the details continued. Emily had identified the safest route through the mountains. Emily had corrected navigation errors. Emily had helped restore communication procedures. Emily had coordinated movement when conditions became unpredictable. Emily had repeatedly solved problems before they became crises. By the end of the report, the room had fallen silent. The story spread quickly. Soldiers who had not participated in the mission began hearing accounts from those who had. Each version sounded remarkably similar. Nobody talked about dramatic speeches or heroic displays. They talked about competence. They talked about preparation. They talked about calm decision-making under pressure. Most of all, they talked about how wrong they had been. Later that afternoon, Captain Mercer requested access to portions of Emily's personnel record for an after-action review. Several leaders gathered around as the information appeared on the screen. The reaction was immediate. Emily had completed advanced mountain operations training years earlier. She had graduated near the top of multiple specialized courses. Her evaluations consistently described her as disciplined, dependable, and exceptionally skilled in terrain analysis and field navigation. None of it was classified. None of it had been hidden. People had simply never bothered to look. Sergeant Logan Brooks stood near the back of the room reading the same information. With every page, his discomfort grew. He remembered the jokes. He remembered the comments. He remembered questioning whether she belonged on the mission. Yet the evidence had been there the entire time. He had chosen assumptions instead of facts. Across the base, attitudes shifted. Soldiers who once overlooked Emily now greeted her with genuine respect. Others quietly reflected on their own behavior. The most surprising part was Emily herself. She returned to her normal routine as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The next morning she reported for duty, completed equipment checks, reviewed schedules, and helped prepare training materials. She did not seek attention. She did not tell stories about the mission. She did not correct people when they praised her. She simply continued doing her job. That quiet consistency left a deeper impression than any speech could have. Because by then, the truth was impossible to ignore. The soldier many had judged by appearance, personality, and assumptions had become the standard others measured themselves against. And throughout Fort Raven, people began realizing that the most valuable lessons from the mission had nothing to do with mountains, weather, or navigation. They had everything to do with respect. The following week, life at Fort Raven slowly returned to normal. Training schedules resumed. Vehicles moved across the motor pool. Morning formations gathered beneath the same flag that had overlooked the base for years. On the surface, everything looked unchanged. Yet anyone paying attention could feel the difference. Emily Carter walked through the installation exactly as she always had. She arrived early, completed her assignments, and focused on the responsibilities in front of her. The only thing that had changed was how people responded when she entered a room. Conversations no longer stopped because of doubt. They stopped because of respect. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her before now greeted her by name. Younger service members sought her advice. Team leaders listened when she offered observations. None of it seemed to affect Emily. She remained the same quiet professional she had always been. One cool morning, the unit gathered for a training exercise near the edge of the base. Captain Daniel Mercer reviewed objectives while soldiers organized equipment and prepared for the day ahead. As Emily completed a routine inspection, a familiar voice approached from behind. It was Sergeant Logan Brooks. For a moment he stood silently, as though searching for the right words. Then he extended his hand. Emily looked at him, then accepted the gesture. "I owe you an apology," Logan said. There was no audience, no dramatic moment, just two soldiers standing beside a row of vehicles. "I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you," he continued. "I was wrong." Emily studied him for a second before giving a small nod. "We all learn." The simplicity of her response caught him off guard. She was not interested in making him feel guilty. She was not interested in proving a point. She had already moved beyond it. Logan smiled faintly and stepped back. For the first time since they had met, there was genuine mutual respect between them. Later that afternoon, Captain Mercer addressed the unit. He spoke about teamwork, preparation, and professionalism. Then he shared a lesson from the mission that everyone immediately understood. "Competence does not always announce itself," he said. "Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one talking the least. Judge people by their actions, not your assumptions." Nobody needed him to explain further. Every soldier knew exactly who he meant. Across the formation, several eyes turned toward Emily. She looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. As soon as the briefing ended, she returned to work. Months later, new soldiers arriving at Fort Raven would hear stories about the mountain mission. Some versions grew larger with retelling. Others focused on different details. But one fact remained consistent in every account. A soldier many people underestimated had quietly become the person everyone depended on when it mattered most. And long after the mission faded into memory, the lesson remained. Respect was never demanded. Respect was earned. Emily Carter had understood that from the beginning. It simply took everyone else a little longer to learn it.